All right. I think we are live on YouTube. Let's make sure that we are recording. Okay, here we go. Share my screen. Present the slides. And let's make sure that we are recording locally so that we have a recording to send you guys. And we can begin. So welcome everyone to this webinar about how government agencies can speed up their policy implementation using automation. A little different from the other webinars that we do, but I think that you'll find that a lot of the principles that we talk about when we're talking about customer support automation or marketing automation, automating marketing conversations rather, because marketing automation obviously primarily refers to email marketing automation, but you'll find that the principles that we apply to those areas apply to the world of state and local government as well. And in fact, I would argue that they apply in greater measure to state and local government, because often the problems that state and local government face are more acute in terms of having a resource crunch than just regular businesses. So what we're going to explore today is how chatbots specifically as a tool for automation can be factored into a policy rollout or a policy implementation effort, and how it can help catalyze that policy implementation effort. As always with these webinars, I am your host. I'm Arnav. I'm a content marketer over here at Taurus. And essentially what that means is I help make content just like this webinar to help, well, in this case, state and local governments out there deliver a better citizen experience to their constituents and to get their services, make their services more accessible to citizens by making the information associated with those services more accessible, which is actually what we are primarily going to be talking about in today's session. Now, who we are as a company, Taurus has been around since 2016, and we've worn many hats in that time. In fact, we wear many hats today as well. But perhaps most important for this session, I think, is the idea that over the last 4 years, we've been helping state and local governments scale their services and customer support using chatbots. So the way that looks is, I mean, if you look at a traditional state or local government agency, you usually don't have a call center, you usually have a website, and oftentimes those aren't enough to give citizens the service that they desire. Websites tend to be clunky, government websites especially, and call center lines tend to be clogged up and you have to wait for a long time. We slot in there with our chatbots, sort of bring the best of both of those worlds together and create a customer service, a citizen service solution that helps governments get their information to citizens at scale, so that they know exactly how to avail of the services that government offers, and so that they actually feel like their state and local government cares about them and is serving them. But we'll get into that more in detail in this webinar, because again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, that is primarily what we are going to be discussing today. Now, for today's webinar, the structure that I'm adopting is I've divided the webinar up into 4 parts. In the first part, we're going to be talking about a basic concept that I think is key to understanding this topic, and that's the concept of stakeholder buy-in. Now, stakeholder buy-in, as we'll discuss in the section, is this idea that you need everyone who's involved in a policy, whether they're implementing it, whether they're benefiting from it, to be bought into that policy for it to work. We sort of flesh out what exactly stakeholder buy-in is and how you get it in that first section. Then we transition into the issues that exist with traditional communication. So one of the key points in the first section is going to be that communication is how you get stakeholder buy-in. And then we're going to diagnose what the sort of issues are with the traditional ways that state and local governments communicate with their citizens, which in turn would contribute to a lack of stakeholder buy-in. And then finally, in section 3, or not finally, penultimately, I guess, in section 3, we'll talk about how you can improve communication using automation, specifically chatbots. And then finally, if there are any questions at the end, I'd be more than happy to answer them in section 4. We always allocate a little bit of time at the end just so that you guys can get any questions that you have off your chest, and hopefully I can answer them as well. That being said, please do feel free to drop questions while I'm going along in the webinar. I'll be more than happy to answer them if it makes sense to answer them at the time. But with that, I think we should be good to go, and we should be good to start the main content of this webinar. Oh, quick logistical note before we continue. We are recording this webinar. We are streaming it live to YouTube. So if you want access to this webinar after, if you need to leave early for whatever reason, if you joined late for whatever reason and you want to see what I said on the previous slide, don't worry about it. We will send you a recording after the session is done. And my colleague Abhilash has been so kind as to send the link to the YouTube live stream in the chat in case anyone wants to watch on YouTube instead of Zoom for whatever reason. But let's begin with the actual content of today's webinar. First section, importance of stakeholder buy-in. Now, I think a good place to start talking about this section is talking about the main problem that we are trying to solve in this webinar, and that is the policy implementation gap. We've seen that what often happens with even the most well-intentioned, well-thought-out government policy is that they look great on paper, but then when it comes to actually implementing it, when it comes to actually rolling it out, and it comes to actually meeting the citizens where they are to get a policy implemented, there is a lack of follow-through, or there's an inability to follow through completely. Now, this honestly isn't really on the part of government officials, I think. Often government officials are asked to do 200% of the work with 50% of the resources. The process of implementing a policy, the process of rolling out a policy is obviously extremely difficult. Like I mentioned in the earlier slides, it's in many ways more difficult than just selling a regular product if you were a business, because everyone absolutely needs your policy, or citizens absolutely will need the outcomes of policies and initiatives. They don't necessarily need specific products. So it raises the stakes a little bit, and often you're doing it at a scale that's unheard of in the private sector because you are obviously implementing it to an entire citizenry as opposed to just convincing who you can to buy your product. Now, one of the common causes that we've seen for the policy implementation gap existing is stakeholder participation or stakeholder buy-in being the problem. And essentially what stakeholder buy-in is, or stakeholder participation is, like I mentioned on the first slide, is you want all of the stakeholders, everyone who is in some way connected to the policy, whether they're your employees implementing the policy, whether they're the citizens benefiting from the policy, whether they're the administrators overseeing the policy's implementation, you want everyone to be on the same page. You want everyone to know what role the policy plays, how the policy is going to help the community, and you obviously want everyone to agree that the policy actually does. You want some form of consensus that the policy is something that should be implemented and should be implemented well. Now, stakeholder buy-in, stakeholder participation on the part of employees is not really a topic that we are primarily going to be focusing on today. It is something that people have to figure out, but I think it's a relatively easier problem than getting buy-in from citizens, because obviously citizens tend to number a lot more than employees, and they're often quite diverse, as are employees, but when you apply it to a larger population, they're quite diverse. So creating a sort of communication that gets people to buy into your policy at scale across a diverse citizenry can be extremely hard for government agencies. And fundamentally, getting that stakeholder buy-in, especially from your citizens, is a communication problem. What agencies have to do, essentially, to get citizen buy-in is to effectively communicate the benefits of a policy and how stakeholders can effectively participate in it. and I think the best way to convey what we mean by this is to look at an example. So one of the government agencies that we've helped implement chatbots for is the Montana DMV. And specifically, we helped them with one of the projects we helped them on was with their Real ID rollout. So Real ID, obviously, a couple of years ago, the federal government passes a law saying that driver's licenses, if you want to use them to travel on flights, have to be updated to be Real ID compliant, which is an additional layer of security verification that that makes your driver's licenses more secure and therefore able to be used as ID when you are flying within the country. Now, implementing Real ID in the state of Montana is obviously was in the state of Montana, it was actually a voluntary thing. You don't have to get Real ID if you don't want to. You can travel with your passport if you do. But obviously, there's an incentive for the state to get a Real ID in as many people's hands as possible because, one, it's more secure, and two, because it's a source of revenue. Getting people to upgrade their license does have a set of fees associated with, which obviously go to the state and can be reinvested in more community initiatives. So now the state of Montana on its hands essentially had a communication problem. What they had to do was they had to go to their citizens and convince them to get Real ID licenses. And if that is not a marketing and communication problem, I don't know what it is, because essentially they have a product that they need to convince their citizens to buy. Now, obviously, this product is more of a basic utility, but nonetheless, the citizens do have a choice on whether to buy it or not, or whether to get the Real ID or not to get the Real ID. And the way we helped them was to improve their communication. But if you look at that problem, if you zoom out and you look at that problem on an objective level, I think we can all agree that it is fundamentally a communication problem. And actually, if you compare the way Montana implemented their Real ID versus how other states implemented their Real ID, you can see how good communication or a lack thereof can affect the rollout. So I think Real ID has been delayed a couple of times. The implementation of Real ID as the exclusive license that you can use to travel domestically has been delayed a couple of times. And the reason it's been delayed is because of, I believe, low uptake in some states. So it did get delayed, I think, at least once. I think it might have been finally rolled out now, but the point being that communication is really going to make or break whether your policy is going to be implemented properly or not. So the next question we need to ask ourselves is, what's the issue with communication? If governments were effective at communicating with citizens, if governments were effective at getting that stakeholder buy-in, then talking about policy implementation and how to improve it wouldn't really be on the cards. We wouldn't be hosting this webinar. Every policy that gets adopted by a government at any level would be rolled out smoothly. And we all know that that is not the case. In fact, it rarely is, or it often isn't the case, rather. So a good starting point, I think, is to first diagnose what the problems are. So let's take a look at what traditional citizen communication looks like, traditional citizen engagement looks like, and see what the issues are with those forms of communication. And then once we identify those issues, we can sort of figure out where chatbots might figure into a government's communication strategy. And how they can translate into greater buy-in. So a quick overview of what the traditional modes of communication are, or traditional categories of communication are. I've divided them up into two buckets over here. This is primarily what we've seen most government agencies have. There are human-based communication systems and there are text-based systems. Human-based systems are your call centers, your live chats, your email, even your offices. If you have physical offices, in the DMV example, for example, the DMV has physical offices. You can walk into a DMV and speak to an employee if you so please. I don't know why you'd want to do that because the DMV is always packed, but you could. That is a form of human-based communication. It's where you are conveying information as an agency through an employee or through someone who represents the agency, whether that's the person on the call center, whether that's someone on live chat, whether it's someone on email, or whether that's someone in the office. The second approach that you can take is a text-based system. Now, in the online realm, which is what we're focusing on primarily, this is your website and all of the elements on it, your FAQs, your policy pages, your agency webpage, things like that. Those are the sorts of resources that we primarily associate with text-based systems. And in the physical world as well, these exist. So when you walk into a DMV, there's obviously brochures, there's forms that you as a citizen can, or citizens can pick up and read through. That is also a text-based form of communication. So I think what we're going to do next is we're going to take each one of these modes of communication, and we are going to take a look at how they're implemented and what some of the challenges associated with them are. So let's start with human-based communication. Now, I think that human-based communication is the gold standard in customer service, in citizen service. And that's because human beings are easy to talk to. We've all been in a situation, if we take a step back and take off our government employee hats and put on our citizen hats. If we take a step back and we think about ourselves as citizens or ourselves as customers, we've all been in a situation where we've tried to look for a piece of information online, where we've tried to learn more about a policy. We've tried to learn more about, say in the Real ID example, why we'd want to get Real ID. And we don't get anywhere on a government website, because government websites are often confusing. They're filled with text. They've got pages about pretty much everything over there. Finding the exact right one that meets your needs is often a Herculean task, if not impossible. So we take the natural next step. We get on the phone and call the helpline. And once we do actually get through to someone on that helpline, it's a good experience, generally speaking. The person on the other end, maybe they're not the nicest person, but they're able to understand what you're asking them. They're able to understand what your problem is, and they're able to direct you in the right place at the very least, if not solve it on the phone call itself. And this is why we see so many people defaulting to calling call centers, to going in person to talk to someone, or to even submitting contact forms to start an email conversation. The issue, though, with a human-based system is that they're prohibitively expensive. Setting up a call center, setting up a customer service team or a citizen engagement team is expensive, and often governments don't have the resources to do it effectively. Setting up a call center that works 24/7 to field queries from thousands of citizens at a time is a resource intensive project. Government employees do not have the time to do that. You guys obviously have a million other things on your plate to deal with, other than this repetitive question that a few dozen citizens have on a given day. And the end result of it being expensive is you're being asked to choose as an agency between paying less and having less coverage with your human-based systems, less coverage with your call center to convey that information to your citizens, and having a long wait time. So if you do pay less, what ends up happening is you have less coverage, you have a long wait time, or you can pay more and eat that cost and have full coverage, but obviously it is going to be expensive. So that is the bad part of human-based customer service, human-based citizen engagement. But there's also an even worse part. There is the ugly of human-based systems. And that's that events like the pandemic, if there's anything that the past year and a half have taught us, events like the pandemic, natural disasters, they do happen. And often they can disrupt your human-based customer service operation, your human-based citizen engagement operation. And that is a problem, especially in the world of local and state government, because often the resources, the policies, the initiatives that state and local government are providing people see increased demand during times of distress. And it's absolutely imperative that you are available when these sorts of events happen. But if you are fully reliant on a call center to get a lot of your communication across, to answer people's questions, to get them to fully buy in to your policies, then that's not going to happen if your customer service agents, your citizen service engagement agents can't get into the office and answer phone calls. So this is something, especially in the context of the past year and a half, almost 2 years now. Actually, is it almost 2 years? No, past year and a half. I've lost all sense of time, but past year and a half, it's definitely something to keep in mind. And that brings us to text-based communication. Text-based communication in a lot of ways addresses the bad and the ugly slides that we were just talking about, but it has its own set of problems. So let's take a look at how text-based communication, this is your websites, this is your FAQ pages, this is your agency's web page. Let's see how they fare compared to human-based communication. So on the good side, text-based systems solve the problems of human-based systems, right? You set up a web page once, it's cheap. There's no effort involved after setup unless you have to change a little piece of text. If the policy changes, or if something changes about the policy, if something changes about the initiative, then you need to go in and edit it. But largely speaking, you put a web page up and it stays there forever. And the best part, obviously, is that they're always available and they can interact with a million people at once, actually infinite people at once. As many people as you want can interact with your web page, can read the information on your web page without your web page going down. And that is a huge benefit to governments, because if you want to get information out to a ton of people without having them wait on hold, without having them, without breaking the bank to set up a massive call center operation, then a website is an effective way to go, because you put that text out there and then the citizens can come and serve themselves. They can find the information that they need and get their questions answered. The issue, though, is that in theory it works, but in practice it often doesn't, because text-based communication systems are often quite unengaging. I mean, we talked about this before when we were talking about human-based systems, but the journey that we often see citizens go through to find information that they're looking for about a policy, how they can get a real ID, for example, goes something like this. They go to a web page, they do a Google search, say real ID, they land on a government web page, they try to find the information they're looking for. What documents do I need to bring to my appointment if I want to get a real ID? How much is it going to cost? They go through the page, they find an extremely confusing set of instructions which say, if you meet this condition, it's going to cost you this much and you need these documents. If you meet that condition, it's going to cost you this much and you need these documents. If you meet this set of conditions, you can't get it at all. So you reach a page that looks like that. You're not able to decipher what applies to you. You're not able to translate the governmentese, if you will, the officialese, if you will. And then as a citizen, what do you do next? You get frustrated, you throw your hands up in the air, you either put off the process of buying in to that policy, or you give the call center a call. So in a way, the call center is actually fixing the problems with websites as opposed to the other way around, even though it should be the other way around. And the way I like to think about it is that people do not read through Facebook posts. They do not read through their, they don't read through their Twitter feeds, let alone reading through an entire page about, or in some cases, an entire PDF about a specific government policy. So this is the fundamental dilemma of citizen engagement. This is the fundamental dilemma of communicating to citizens that government agencies need to deal with. You need to choose between a human-based communication system, which is effective because human beings are great at expressing themselves. They're great at conveying to citizens pieces of information in a way that they can understand, but they're expensive and they are disruptible. Call centers can be easily disrupted by events like a pandemic, like a hurricane, and they're expensive to set up. On the flip side, you have text-based systems, which are the opposite, the inverse. They're cheap and reliable. Your page is likely not going to go down, but they are ineffective at conveying information because Citizens just don't have the patience to read through a clunky government webpage. So which do you choose as a government agency? Often what people do is they choose both. They choose to have both a call center and a website available for citizens to get the information that they need. But that doesn't really work, because what you end up with is the downsides of both. Like I said, with that average citizen journey that we see, people land on the page, they're not able to find what they're looking for. They call the call center, they wait on hold, or they call outside of work hours and they're not able to get through to anyone. So you just end up with the downsides of both. And that is where automation comes into the picture. Specifically, what we are going to talk about today is chatbots. So chatbots sit in this sweet spot between the human-based systems and the text-based systems. They sort of marry the best of both of these worlds. They're easy to talk to. They're easy to interact with, unlike your websites, but like your human-based citizen engagement systems, because they're framed as a conversation. Just the fact that you are framing this interaction of getting information into citizens' hands as a conversation where they have to chat with you to get the information that they're looking for, that in and of itself primes citizens to approach the interaction in a different way. Instead of viewing it as a chore, as a task that they have to do, to go through this web page and read through the text, they feel like they're actually getting customer service from someone at the government or something, because it's a piece of software. And that turns reading the text that's on the page into getting customer service, which are two completely different interactions. The way I like to think about it is, if you were to walk into an actual physical office and speak to a government employee, there are two ways that they can go about collecting information from you. They can either ask you for the information one detail at a time and input it into the computer, or they can hand you a clipboard with a pen. Both of those processes result in the same outcome. The agency gets the exact same information. But I don't know about you guys. I personally don't like filling out forms myself. The experience of talking to someone and giving that information by talking to them is very different than sitting in a corner with a clipboard and a pen and filling it out myself. So that is the fundamental difference between reading text on a website and reading text in a conversational form factor like that of a chatbot. And that's what makes chatbots easier to interact with, easier to talk to than your web pages. So we're addressing that ineffectiveness problem that we talked about with web pages, where people don't want to read the text that's there, and they just want to talk to someone over the phone. What we're doing is we're taking that same text and we're making it look like a conversation that they would be having. So in a sense, it's a little bit of UX trickery, where we are tricking on a subliminal level, we're, I guess, tricking the user's brain into thinking that they're having a conversation when all they're doing is they're reading the same text that they would have otherwise read on a web page. The second advantage of a chat-based system, a chatbot, automated chat-based system of getting information into the hands of citizens, is that they can explain complex concepts. So just like with a conversation with a human being, conversations can branch off in different directions. In fact, the way that we build conversations in the Taurus platform is through a flowchart builder. So you build a flowchart of your conversation, and essentially citizens navigate that flowchart to find the exact information that they need while they're having the conversation. Well, the beauty of that flowchart method of structuring interactions is that it makes it easier to explain complex concepts. So remember earlier when I was talking about how when people land on pages, on government pages, there are a whole bunch of conditions on the page, where if you meet these sets of conditions, this is how much it's going to cost for you, and these are the documents you need to bring. If you meet this other set of conditions, it's a different set of documents, different set of costs, and maybe even a completely different policy, a completely different department. Well, if you present that on a web page, essentially what you do is you have a word dump on the page. You just have all of these conditions listed out, and it's on the citizen to go through them, figure out which applies to them, and then read only that part of the page. That seems wasteful in terms of space, because every citizen is only going to have to read a few words on that page, but still you show every citizen all the words on that page. With chatbots, on the other hand, since it's in this back and forth conversational form of interaction, what happens is the chatbot sends the citizen a short message saying, "Hey, how can I help you?" The citizen responds with their specific needs, and then the chatbot can respond again saying, "Okay, do you meet this condition?" The citizen can say yes or no. "Do you meet that condition?" The citizen can say yes or no, or maybe, or "I'm confused," and then the chatbot can clarify it, just like they would if they were talking to someone in person in an office or over the phone. And then eventually, at the end of that line of questioning, when you follow all of these branches of the flowchart, you reach the end point where you only get the information that you need as a citizen. And that prevents information overload from happening because you're not confronted with this verbose page. It also keeps you engaged as a citizen because you're constantly being asked to press something on the screen or type something out on the screen. That keeps you more engaged in the conversation. But the overall outcome is that it's easier to explain complex concepts, or it's easier to explain lists of conditions, like I said, which are very common in the world of policy implementation. Perhaps the biggest advantage for a lot of agencies of chatbots, though, is that they're cheap. So you have all of these advantages that you normally associate with human-based systems, where you can explain complex concepts, it's engaging and people actually read or they actually interact with the information you're sending them, but they don't come with the associated cost. You don't need to set up a call center to run a chatbot. You just create one chatbot, you put it up on your site, and it can talk to as many people as you want at the same time, at any time of day, which I think is my next slide. So we can do this together. Chatbots are always available, and they're always available, and they can have infinite concurrent conversations at once, but you only need one chatbot to achieve all of that because it's a piece of software, right? It's a piece of software living on a server somewhere that can talk to infinite people at once at any time of day. You don't need to set up an expensive call center. You don't need to hire people to man that call center. You can just have the chatbot up. So in a sense, chatbots are sort of the perfect middle ground. We talked about it being a middle ground. In a sense, they are the perfect middle ground between the human-based and text-based ways of citizen engagement. They are able to convey information to citizens in a conversational form factor that makes it easy to understand complex concepts and makes it easy to digest the information being sent to you. But they do it at a price point that is affordable for governments, and is actually feasible for governments to implement. So tying this back into the initial problem that we were talking about with citizen buy-in, let's take an example again, the Real ID example. You want people to get these Real ID licenses as a state agency. You need to get information in their hands about Real ID. You need to convey to them why Real ID might be in their best interest, what benefits they get from Real ID, and what the actual process of getting Real ID looks like, what documents they need to bring into the office, what appointment they need to book, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what's the best way of doing that? You can put up a web page like you normally do that has all of that information. Citizen's going to land on it, and they are not necessarily going to be able to decipher anything from that web page because that's what government web pages are famous for. They can, from there, call a call center, which might not be available if it's outside of work hours, and might have a long wait time, even if it is inside of work hours. Or the alternative is they can interact with the chatbot. That chatbot's going to respond to them immediately, regardless of what time of day it is. And the chatbot's going to have all of the information that they need, but presented in a way that's actually consumable. Now, that information, by having that interaction with the chatbot instead, that information actually gets across to the citizen. The citizen is actually able to understand all of those key points that they need to know about the policy. They're able to understand why the policy benefits them. They're able to understand how they can avail or participate in that policy or in that initiative. And that makes them more well-informed to make this decision about whether to buy into it or not, whether to get the Real ID or not get the Real ID. And that, in turn, helps governments get more people to participate, get more people to buy in to their policies, and overall just implement the policy more effectively. At the end of the day, you can just think of chatbots as an information communication tool. They are more effective at communicating information to your citizens than your traditional systems in a lot of ways. And that is what makes them a good tool to help you implement your policies at a faster rate. Now, I think that is pretty much it for this webinar. I hope this helped you understand a little bit more about where chatbots can figure into your policy rollout plans. But if you guys have any questions right now, now's the time to ask them. I'd be more than happy to answer. I'll maybe give it a minute or so. That's usually how long it takes for questions to arise. But if you don't have any questions, totally all right. We can end the session a little early today, and you guys can check out the recording after, and we can all go on with our days. And for those of you, what I maybe can do is I'll go through the contact details just so that you guys know how to get in touch with us. And if we don't have any questions by the time I go through the contact details, we can end the session. So if you guys need to call us, phone numbers on the screen. You can call us, you can text us, you can send us WhatsApp. I'm also available on email. It's just arnav@hellotaurus.com. So Arnav and then the Taurus website. And then finally, I highly suggest you go to our website, hellotaurus.com, because you can find a bunch of great information about chatbots. Other than signing up for a product and building a chatbot yourself, exploring how you can actually implement a chatbot for your government agency, we have a lot of resources on our website that can educate you about chatbots. So if you're still not fully sure about implementing a chatbot in your government agency, I highly suggest you go to our website just to learn more about the technology. And maybe after you read all of that information, you realize, hey, maybe chatbots aren't right for my particular use case, and that's totally fine. But again, keeping in line with the theme of this webinar, the more information that you have, the better informed you are, and the better positioned you are to make an actual decision about whether you want to go through with this decision or not of getting a chatbot. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for joining us. Always a pleasure hosting these webinars for you guys. Keep a lookout for our future webinars. I hope to see you guys there.